He thought it would be easy. Walk in, say the wrong things, make the night uncomfortable, collect the money, and walk away. Just another favor for a stranger who promised quick cash. Cash he desperately needed to keep the lights on and food on the table for his little boy. But the moment he sat across from her, something felt different. She smiled first. Not the nervous kind, not the polite kind. A smile that carried stories, strength, and a quiet confidence that caught him off guard. He reminded himself why he was there. One bad date. That was all it was supposed to be. He tried to follow the plan. Awkward jokes, careless words, subtle cruelty disguised as honesty. Yet with every attempt to push her away, her response wasn't anger, it was grace. She listened, she laughed, and when she spoke, her words landed heavier than any insult he could throw. Each sentence chipped away at the wall he'd built around his heart. Then came the moment he didn't expect. The question that made his chest tighten. The look in her eyes that said she knew more than he realized. In that instant, he wasn't a man on a mission anymore. He was a father, a broken soul, sitting across from someone who saw right through him. What she did next would leave him questioning his choices, his morals, and the kind of example he wanted to set for his son. This wasn't just a blind date. It was a turning point. He stared at his phone long after the message stopped blinking, the room quiet except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the uneven breathing of his son asleep on the couch. The words were simple, almost casual, as if they weren't asking him to cross a line. Just go on the date. Make her uncomfortable. She'll leave early. You'll get paid. He told himself it wasn't really hurting anyone. People had bad dates all the time. This one just came with an envelope of cash attached to it. Money had become a constant ache in his chest. Bills stacked on the kitchen table like silent accusations, rent overdue, school fees looming. Every calculation ended the same way, with him coming up short. He worked hard, took extra shifts, skipped meals, but it was never enough. When you're a single father, pride becomes a luxury you can't afford. Survival takes its place. He glanced at his son again, small hands curled into fists, trusting the world without knowing how fragile that trust was. That image became his justification. I'm doing this for him, he thought. Not for greed, not for cruelty, just for one night of discomfort that could turn into weeks of stability. He promised himself he'd be subtle, nothing outright cruel. Just enough to make the date fail. On the way to the restaurant, guilt rode shotgun. He practiced lines in his head, the kind of careless comments that could sour a mood without sounding outright offensive. He hated how easily they came to him. It scared him, realizing how simple it was to put on a different version of himself when desperation demanded it. The restaurant was warmer than he expected, lights low and soft, the kind of place meant for conversation and first impressions. He checked his watch twice before she arrived, heart beating faster with every passing second. He told himself to stay focused. This wasn't about connection, it was about finishing the job. When he saw her walking toward the table, he froze for a moment. She moved with confidence, not rushing, not shrinking. People noticed her, some curious, some awkwardly trying not to stare. She didn't flinch. She held her head high, eyes forward, and when she reached the table, she smiled like she belonged there. That smile unsettled him more than anything else. He introduced himself, forcing his voice into a casual tone. She responded easily, as if this were just another normal evening, as if she hadn't spent a lifetime navigating rooms not designed for her. That realization made his rehearsed lines feel heavier in his mouth. Still, he tried. He made an offhand comment about how blind dates were always risky. He joked about expectations and disappointment, letting the words linger just long enough to sting. She listened without interrupting, nodding thoughtfully. Instead of shrinking back, she met his eyes. She spoke calmly, explaining how expectations were often other people's burdens, not hers. Her voice wasn't defensive, it was steady, certain. He felt something twist inside him, an unfamiliar discomfort that had nothing to do with money. He pushed again, mentioning how life was already complicated enough without adding extra challenges. The sentence tasted bitter the moment it left his mouth. He waited for anger, for hurt, for the quick end he'd been paid to deliver. But she didn't give him that. She smiled softly and replied that everyone carried challenges, some were just visible. She talked about learning early that her worth wasn't measured by how comfortable she made others feel. Each word landed with quiet force, dismantling the careless assumptions behind his act. As the minutes passed, the script in his head unraveled. The man who had walked in with a mission found himself hesitating, stumbling over his next attempt. He thought of his son again, and for the first time that night, the justification didn't sit right. He wondered what lesson he was teaching, not with words, but with actions. He realized then that desperation hadn't just pushed him to accept the money. It had tempted him to forget who he was. And sitting across from her, listening to her speak with dignity and calm, he felt the weight of that truth settle in, heavier than any unpaid bill. He noticed it slowly at first, the way her presence refused to shrink no matter how uncomfortable the moment became. Every time he expected her to pull back, she leaned in just enough to stay human, to stay real. It confused him. Kindness wasn't part of the plan. Resistance was easier to handle than grace. He tried shifting tactics, letting silence stretch longer than it should, hoping the awkward gaps would push her away. He looked at his phone, nodded absently, acted distracted. Anyone else might have taken the hint. She didn't. She waited, patient, as if his attention, or lack of it, didn't define her value. When she spoke again, it wasn't to fill the silence but to understand it. She asked him how his day had been, not as small talk, but with a sincerity that made the question feel heavier than expected. He gave a shallow answer at first, something safe and forgettable. She accepted it without pressure, without pushing. That ease unsettled him more than confrontation ever could. He decided to be sharper, more direct. He made a comment about how people often romanticized struggle, how it must be exhausting to constantly prove yourself. The words were framed like concern, but they carried an edge. He watched her closely, bracing for the moment he'd been waiting for. Instead, she laughed, softly, without bitterness. She said exhaustion came from pretending to be someone else to make others comfortable, not from being honest about who you are. She explained that kindness, to her, wasn't weakness. It was a choice, one she made daily despite knowing how often it would be misunderstood. Her calm explanation stripped the power from his cruelty. He felt exposed, like a man throwing stones at a window only to realize he was standing inside the house. Each time she responded with understanding, the version of himself he was pretending to be became harder to maintain. He found himself listening instead of plotting. She spoke about moments when strangers assumed limits for her, about how she learned to let those assumptions pass without carrying them home. She described strength not as toughness, but as the ability to remain gentle in a world that rarely returned the favor. The restaurant noise faded into the background. He noticed the way she held her glass, the confidence in her posture, the absence of apology in her tone. There was no performance in her kindness. No demand for recognition. It simply existed, steady and unshaken. Guilt began to creep in, quiet but persistent. He thought about the envelope of cash promised at the end of the night. For the first time, it felt heavy, like a debt he wasn't sure he could afford to pay. He wondered how many times she'd sat across from someone who came in already decided, already closed off, already convinced they knew her story. He attempted one last push, mentioning how society wasn't built to be fair and how acceptance was often conditional. He framed it like a harsh truth, something meant to shut the conversation down. She nodded, acknowledging the reality of it, then said something that made his breath catch. She said fairness wasn't something she waited for, it was something she practiced. That every interaction was a chance to either harden or soften, and she chose softness, not because it was easy, but because it was powerful. The words lingered between them, heavy and undeniable. He felt something shift inside him, a slow crack forming in the armor he wore to survive. For years, he'd told himself the world was cruel and that he had to be the same to protect his son, to protect himself. But sitting there, faced with someone who had every reason to be guarded yet chose openness, that belief began to unravel. He realized her kindness wasn't naive. It was intentional, and that realization forced him to confront an uncomfortable truth. The problem wasn't the world alone. Sometimes, it was the choices people made when they believed no one was watching. As he sat across from her, the plan he'd agreed to felt smaller, meaner, and painfully transparent. He wasn't just failing at sabotaging a date. He was being invited, without accusation or anger, to see himself clearly, and that, more than anything, left him shaken. The realization didn't arrive all at once. It crept in quietly, settling between his thoughts, refusing to be ignored. He became painfully aware of his posture, the tension in his shoulders, the way he had entered the evening prepared to perform a version of himself he didn't respect. Across from him, she remained exactly who she had been from the start, unchanged, unguarded, and deeply present. He thought about his son again, not as an excuse this time, but as a mirror. He imagined the boy years from now, watching how his father treated people when no one else was keeping score. The image tightened his chest. He wondered what kind of man he was teaching his child to become, not through lectures or advice, but through the silent choices that shaped character. Her words replayed in his mind, each one stripping away the layers of justification he'd built so carefully. She spoke about dignity as something internal, something that couldn't be taken unless it was surrendered. Listening to her, he realized how often he'd given pieces of his own dignity away in the name of survival, telling himself it was temporary, necessary, harmless. He felt the weight of the lie pressing against his ribs. Every smile he'd forced, every careless comment he'd planned, now felt like a betrayal, not just of her, but of himself. He noticed how easily she trusted the moment, how she offered openness without demanding safety in return. It was a risk he hadn't taken in years. For the first time that night, he allowed silence to exist without strategy. In that space, his thoughts grew louder. He acknowledged the truth he'd been avoiding. Desperation hadn't made him accept the deal. Fear had. Fear of failing. Fear of not being enough. Fear of a future he couldn't control. She asked him then what he wanted his son to learn about people. The question was gentle, almost casual, yet it struck him harder than anything else that had been said. He stumbled over his answer, words tangling as he tried to respond honestly. He spoke about kindness, about respect, about standing up for others. As he spoke, he felt the contradiction burn. He wasn't living the values he claimed to believe in. She listened without judgment, nodding slowly, as if she understood the gap between intention and action. She said that most people weren't cruel by nature, they were just afraid of being vulnerable. She explained how choosing compassion often meant standing still long enough to feel uncomfortable, long enough to see the person in front of you rather than the story you'd been told about them. Her insight left him exposed. He realized he'd come into the evening carrying a story written by someone else, one that reduced her to an obstacle, a task, a means to an end. And yet, she had responded by writing her own story in real time, one marked by patience and strength. He imagined walking away with the money, explaining nothing, returning home with groceries and relief. The thought no longer felt like victory. It felt hollow. He understood then that some costs didn't show up on bills or bank statements. Some debts lingered in the quiet moments, shaping who you became. He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not a role in someone else's plan, but a person who had unknowingly held up a mirror to his choices. He felt a shift inside him, subtle but irreversible. The version of himself who had agreed to the deal was slipping away, replaced by someone forced to reckon with his own values. In that moment, the future felt uncertain in a new way, not defined by fear or scarcity, but by responsibility. Responsibility to his son. Responsibility to himself. Responsibility to the humanity sitting across the table from him. He understood now that this night was never about ruining a date. It was about a crossroads he hadn't expected to face, where the easiest path was no longer the right one, and the hardest choice was simply to be honest, with her, and with himself.